John, a man whose life peaked at successfully installing Arch Linux on his grandmother's old ThinkPad twice, considered himself a paragon of suburban normalcy. He mowed his lawn on Sundays, pretended to enjoy small talk with his neighbors about the weather, and even occasionally attended HOA meetings, purely for the entertainment value, of course. Little did he know, his quiet life was about to be flushed down the toilet, quite literally. It was a Tuesday. Tuesdays are the Mondays of the work-from-home world. When John returned from a particularly soul-crushing Zoom meeting, something about synergizing workflows and leveraging best practices, he parked his Prius in the driveway, a monument to middle-class aspirations, and noticed something amiss. The air hung heavy with a pungent aroma, a sophisticated blend of eau de toilette and questionable life choices. His perfectly manicured lawn, usually a source of immense pride and fodder for passive-aggressive competition with Mrs. Henderson next door, had transformed into a murky swamp. Bubbles, ominous and brown, percolated on the surface of what was once his prize-winning petunias. "Ha!" John muttered, adjusting his glasses. "That's not ideal." He cautiously approached the edge of his property, like a scientist studying a particularly disgusting new species. The water, if you could call it that, was the color of regret and smelled vaguely of a forgotten gym sock that had gone on a solo backpacking trip through a sewage treatment plant. Now, John wasn't a plumber. He was, as mentioned, a software engineer, a noble profession that involved staring at a screen all day and occasionally muttering incantations to appease the code gods. But even he could recognize that something was terribly, horribly wrong. He followed the flow of stuff to its source, a storm drain on the edge of his property, spewing forth a torrent of filth like a disgruntled kraken vomiting its lunch. "Oh, for crying out loud," John sighed. He knew deep down that this wasn't just a random act of nature. This was the work of the HOA. The Homeowners Association, or HOA, was a shadowy organization that ruled their suburban enclave with an iron fist and a meticulously detailed rulebook. They dictated everything from the acceptable shade of beige for your mailbox to the precise height of your grass. They were, in essence, a benevolent dictatorship masquerading as a community service. And at the helm of this tyrannical regime was Karen. Karen was the president of the HOA, a woman whose very name conjured images of perfectly coiffed hair, oversized sunglasses, and an unwavering belief in her own infallibility. She was the kind of person who used words like synergy and bandwidth in everyday conversation and genuinely believed that she was making the world a better place by enforcing the HOA's draconian rules. John had crossed paths with Karen before, usually during heated debates about the proper placement of his Christmas lights or the unapproved presence of a gnome in his garden. Each encounter left him feeling slightly violated and questioning the very fabric of reality. He knew that confronting Karen was going to be an uphill battle, a Sisyphean task of arguing with a brick wall that had a penchant for power suits and condescending remarks. But he had no choice. His backyard was rapidly transforming into a biohazard zone, and his property value was plummeting faster than a Bitcoin in a bear market. He trudged through the muck, his sandals squelching with each step, until he reached the sidewalk. He pulled out his phone and dialed the number for the HOA, bracing himself for the inevitable onslaught of bureaucratic jargon and dismissive platitudes. "HOA, this is Karen. How can I help you?" "Enhance your community experience." Her voice dripped with a saccharine sweetness that could rot your teeth at 50 paces. "Karen, it's John," he said, trying to keep the exasperation out of his voice. "My backyard is currently flooded with sewage, like actual sewage. It's coming from the storm drain." There was a pause, long enough for John to hear Karen take a sip of her probably organic, fair trade, locally sourced tea. "John, are you suggesting that the HOA is responsible for this unfortunate situation?" "Well, unless a rogue band of sewer goblins decided to target my property specifically, yeah, I'm pretty sure it's the HOA's responsibility to maintain the drainage system." Karen sighed, a dramatic, theatrical sigh that could rival a Shakespearean tragedy. "John, we've had some unprecedented rainfall lately. These things happen. Mother Nature, you know? Karen, it hasn't rained in 3 days. And even if it had, The drainage system shouldn't be spewing raw sewage into my backyard. That's not exactly a natural occurrence. Well, I'm sure it's just a temporary inconvenience. We'll have someone look at it eventually. In the meantime, perhaps you could try embracing the situation. Think of it as a unique opportunity to connect with nature. John's eye twitched. Connect with nature? Karen, I'm up to my ankles in human waste. This isn't exactly a Thoreau-esque experience. John, I have a very important meeting about strategic landscaping initiatives to attend. I suggest you contact our maintenance department. Have a blessed day. And with that, she hung up. John stared at his phone in disbelief. He was now officially at war with the HOA. He knew that this was just the beginning, a descent into madness fueled by bureaucratic incompetence and the overwhelming stench of sewage. He looked out at his flooded backyard, at the floating debris and the bubbling sludge, and a slow burn of righteous indignation began to simmer in his gut. This wasn't just about a flooded yard anymore. This was about principle. This was about standing up to tyranny. This was about revenge. They want a flood? John muttered, a glint in his eye. I'll give them a flood they'll never forget. And with that, the seeds of a deliciously petty, outrageously absurd, and potentially illegal plan began to take root in his mind. The HOA had messed with the wrong software engineer. They had messed with his lawn. And now they were going to pay the price. A price measured in cubic yards of concrete. The neighborhood was in a state of controlled chaos. The flood, or rather, the unsolicited water feature, as Karen preferred to call it, had expanded beyond John's backyard. Lawns resembled miniature lakes. Driveways were transformed into impromptu swimming pools, of questionable hygiene, of course. And the collective property values of the entire cul-de-sac were plummeting faster than a politician's approval rating after a scandal. Naturally, the residents were displeased. A gaggle of disgruntled homeowners had gathered near the overflowing storm drain, their faces contorted in various stages of disgust and despair. There was Mrs. Henderson, whose prize-winning roses were now providing sustenance to a family of particularly robust sewer rats. There was Mr. Thompson, whose meticulously maintained lawnmower was currently submerged in the muck, presumably rusting into oblivion. And there was John, trying to blend into the background like a ninja in a beige cardigan. Suddenly, Karen appeared, her perfectly coiffed hair somehow defying the oppressive humidity. She strode towards the gathering, her designer rain boots splashing through the contaminated water with an air of regal disdain. All right, settle down, everyone," she announced, her voice amplified by the sheer force of her personality. "I understand you're all concerned about the temporary water situation, but I assure you, the HOA is working diligently to address the issue." A chorus of groans erupted from the crowd. "Working diligently?" Mrs. Henderson shrieked. "My roses are dead, Karen. Dead. They were heirloom roses, passed down from my great-grandmother. And my lawnmower," Mr. Thompson wailed. "It was a limited edition. They only made 500 of them." Karen rolled her eyes, a subtle gesture that somehow managed to convey the full weight of her exasperation. "Look, people, I understand your frustration, but panicking won't solve anything. We need to remain calm and rational." It was at this point that John decided to intervene. He couldn't stand by and watch Karen gaslight his neighbors any longer. He stepped forward, wading through the knee-deep sludge until he was face-to-face with the HOA president. "Karen," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "is that calm and rational enough for you?" Karen glared at him, her eyes narrowed behind her oversized sunglasses. "John, I should have known you were behind this hysteria." "Hysteria?" John scoffed. "Karen, we're standing in a pool of untreated sewage. It's not hysteria. It's a legitimate health hazard. It's a minor inconvenience," Karen insisted, stubbornly clinging to her narrative. "And frankly, John, your negativity is not helping the situation." "My negativity?" "Karen, your incompetence is the situation. This entire neighborhood is underwater because you and the HOA can't be bothered to maintain the drainage system. "That's not true," Karen retorted, her voice rising in pitch. "We've had some budgetary constraints lately. We had to prioritize strategic initiatives." Strategic initiatives? Like what? Replacing the decorative rocks around the clubhouse? Installing a new putting green for the board members? Those are essential community enhancements, Karen sputtered. Essential for who? The squirrels? The argument escalated, the two of them shouting over each other in the middle of a sewage-filled street. The neighbors watched in morbid fascination, like spectators at a particularly bizarre reality show. Finally, John had enough. He turned and stomped away, muttering under his breath about bureaucratic ineptitude and the existential dread of suburban living. As he sloshed back to his house, a plan began to form in his mind. He realized that arguing with Karen was futile. Reasoning with the HOA was like trying to teach a cat to do algebra. The only way to get their attention was to hit them where it hurt: their wallets, their reputations, and their meticulously manicured sense of order. He spent the rest of the day holed up in his house, fueled by caffeine and righteous anger. He started by diving into the HOA's bylaws, searching for loopholes and violations like a lawyer hunting for a technicality. He scoured the internet for information on homeowners' rights, environmental regulations, and the proper disposal of organic waste. He discovered that the HOA had indeed violated several regulations regarding the maintenance of the drainage system. They had failed to conduct regular inspections, neglected to perform necessary repairs, and generally ignored the warnings of the few sane residents who had raised concerns about the system's deteriorating condition. Armed with this knowledge, John began to formulate his plan. It was audacious, it was risky, and it was almost certainly illegal. But he didn't care. He was past the point of caring about things like consequences and common sense. He envisioned a scenario so outlandish, so over the top, that it would make headlines. He wanted to inflict a level of inconvenience upon the HOA that would make their sewage-induced flooding seem like a minor hiccup. He started by researching the properties of concrete. He learned about its compressive strength, its setting time, and its surprising versatility as a medium for artistic expression. He also researched the layout of the HOA office, its security systems, and its proximity to the local police station. By nightfall, John had a plan. It was a plan so diabolical, so audacious, that it would make Machiavelli blush. He was going to turn the HOA office into a giant, concrete monument to their own incompetence. He spent the next few days secretly acquiring the necessary materials: bags of concrete mix, industrial-strength pumps, a network of flexible hoses, and a collection of oversized novelty garden gnomes, for decorative purposes, of course. He worked under the cover of darkness, transforming his garage into a clandestine concrete mixing operation. He knew that he was walking a dangerous line. If he got caught, he could face serious legal consequences. But the thought of Karen's face when she discovered her office filled with concrete was enough to keep him going. The night was perfect for clandestine concrete operations. Moonless, cloudy, and eerily silent, save for the gentle hum of the industrial-grade pump John had borrowed from a construction site down the street. He fully intended to return it, eventually. He'd spent the past few days meticulously preparing his assault. His garage now resembled a bizarre laboratory, filled with bags of concrete mix, coils of tubing, and a disconcerting number of garden gnomes. He'd even created a detailed blueprint of the HOA office, complete with escape routes and potential booby traps, mostly involving strategically placed rakes. Donning his stealth attire, a black hoodie, black cargo pants, and a pair of suspiciously clean rubber boots, John felt a thrill of adrenaline course through his veins. He wasn't just a software engineer anymore. He was a suburban vigilante, a concrete commando, a champion of the oppressed homeowner. He loaded his Prius, a surprisingly spacious vehicle when you remove the child seat and the yoga mat, with his arsenal of construction supplies. He'd chosen the Prius specifically for its fuel efficiency, a subtle act of rebellion against the gas-guzzling SUVs favored by the HOA board members. Arriving at the HOA office, John felt a surge of anticipation. The building, a nondescript beige box that looked like it had been designed by a committee of accountants, was eerily deserted. The only sign of life was a security camera perched above the entrance, its unblinking eye scrutinizing the parking lot. "Don't worry, little buddy," John muttered to the camera. "You're about to witness a concrete masterpiece." He parked the Prius in a darkened corner of the lot and began to unload his equipment. He started by carefully positioning the pump near the storm drain behind the building, the very same storm drain that had unleashed the sewage apocalypse upon his backyard. The plan was simple, yet elegant. He would use the pump to divert the contaminated water from the clogged storm drain into the HOA office. Then, he would follow up with a generous helping of concrete, turning the entire building into a festering, cement-encrusted monument to bureaucratic incompetence. He connected the hoses, checked the seals, and fired up the pump. The machine sputtered to life, belching out a cloud of exhaust fumes that smelled vaguely of desperation and broken dreams. Slowly but surely, the murky water began to flow, gurgling through the hoses and heading towards its unsuspecting target. Next, John turned his attention to the main event, the concrete. He began mixing the dry powder with water in a large plastic tub, creating a thick, gray slurry that resembled something you might find in a dinosaur's digestive system. As he mixed, he couldn't help but feel a sense of perverse satisfaction. He was creating something destructive, something chaotic, something that would disrupt the carefully constructed world of the HOA. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced since he accidentally deleted the entire database of his company's most important client. With the pump chugging away and the concrete mixing nicely, John approached the HOA office. He'd already disabled the alarm system, a feat that involved a YouTube tutorial and a healthy dose of sheer dumb luck, and now he just needed to find a way inside. He circled the building, searching for an unlocked window or a conveniently located ventilation shaft. Finally, he spotted it. A small, ground-level window that had been carelessly left ajar. "Jackpot," he whispered, sliding the window open and squeezing inside. The office was eerily silent, illuminated only by the faint glow of the emergency exit signs. John crept through the cubicle farm, his heart pounding in his chest. He could almost hear the ghosts of disgruntled homeowners whispering their complaints into the void. He reached the main office, the nerve center of the HOA's operations. This was where Karen held court, where the board members plotted their strategic initiatives, where the fate of the entire neighborhood was decided. John surveyed the room, taking in the meticulously organized desk, the framed diplomas, and the motivational posters featuring inspiring slogans like "Teamwork makes the dream work" and "Synergy is the new black." "Not for long," he muttered, a mischievous grin spreading across his face. He quickly connected the hoses from the pump to the office's ventilation system, ensuring that the sewage water would be evenly distributed throughout the room. Then he began to pour the concrete, slowly but surely filling the office with the thick, gray slurry. The concrete flowed like a slow-motion lava, engulfing the desks, the chairs, and the motivational posters. The air filled with the acrid smell of cement, mingling with the already pungent aroma of sewage. As he poured, John imagined Karen's face when she discovered her office transformed into a concrete swamp. He imagined the board members squirming in their seats as they tried to explain the situation to the insurance company. He imagined the headlines, "HOA office flooded with sewage and concrete." He was so engrossed in his fantasy that he didn't notice the blinking red light of a security camera until it was too late. "Oh, crap," he whispered, realizing that his concrete caper had been caught on film. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed through the office. Someone was coming. John froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He had to get out of there, and fast. He scrambled towards the window, squeezing through the opening just as a security guard rounded the corner. "Hey, stop!" the guard shouted. But John was already sprinting across the parking lot, towards the waiting Prius. He jumped into the car, started the engine, and peeled out of the parking lot, leaving behind a trail of concrete dust and bewildered security guards. As he sped away, he couldn't help but laugh. He had done it. He had flooded the HOA office with concrete. He had struck a blow against bureaucratic tyranny. He was a hero, but he also knew that he was in deep trouble. The security camera had captured his face, and the HOA was sure to press charges. He was now officially a wanted man, a fugitive from suburban justice. The next morning, John awoke to a cacophony of sirens. He peered out his window to find his street swarming with police cars, news vans, and rubbernecking neighbors, all drawn to the spectacle like moths to a particularly garish flame. His house was now officially ground zero for the Great Concrete Caper. As the local news outlets were already calling it, he briefly considered fleeing, packing his bags, and escaping to Mexico, where he could live a life of anonymity, selling artisanal concrete gnomes on the beach. But he knew that running would only make him look guilty. Besides, he wanted to see Karen's face when she realized the full extent of his community improvement project. He opened his front door and was immediately swarmed by reporters, their microphones thrust in his face like aggressive metallic tulips. "Mr. Smith, did you flood the HOA office with concrete? Mr. Smith, do you have any regrets? Mr. Smith, do you think this will affect your property values?" John raised his hands, trying to maintain a semblance of composure. "No comment," he said, adopting his most lawyerly tone. "I'm just a concerned citizen who cares deeply about the well-being of my community." He managed to fight his way through the media scrum and was promptly greeted by two stern-faced police officers. "John Smith?" one of them asked, flashing a badge. "We need you to come with us." "Am I under arrest?" John asked, his voice trembling slightly. "Let's just say we have a few questions about a certain concrete situation at the HOA office." John knew that the jig was up. He was going to spend the day being interrogated by the authorities, while Karen and the HOA board members gloated over his downfall. He was led to a police car and driven to the local precinct, where he was placed in a small, windowless interrogation room. He sat there for hours, staring at the peeling paint and contemplating the existential dread of being questioned by law enforcement. Finally, two detectives entered the room, their faces grim. "Mr. Smith," one of them said, "we have you on camera. We know you were at the HOA office last night." John sighed. "Okay, fine. I was there, but I didn't do anything illegal. I was just inspecting the premises." The detectives exchanged knowing glances. "Inspecting the premises with several tons of concrete?" "It was a very thorough inspection," John replied, trying to keep a straight face. The interrogation continued for hours, with the detectives grilling John about his motives, his methods, and his overall sanity. He stuck to his story, claiming that he was just a concerned citizen who was trying to improve the community. Meanwhile, at the HOA office, the scene was one of utter chaos. The building was a concrete wasteland, with desks, chairs, and computers entombed in a thick layer of cement. Karen was reportedly having a meltdown, screaming at the cleanup crew and threatening to sue everyone involved. The story of the Great Concrete Caper had gone viral, attracting attention from news outlets around the world. The HOA was now a laughingstock, the poster child for bureaucratic ineptitude and suburban dysfunction. Back at the police station, John was finally released, albeit with a stern warning and a court summons. He emerged from the precinct to find another mob of reporters waiting for him. "Mr. Smith, are you a hero or a villain?" one of them shouted. "I'm just a guy who wanted his backyard to stop smelling like sewage," John replied wearily. He returned home to find his house surrounded by well-wishers, offering him support and congratulations. Even Mrs. Henderson, whose roses had been casualties of the flood, gave him a grudging nod of approval. But amidst the chaos and the fanfare, John couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. Karen and the HOA weren't just going to let this go. They were plotting their revenge, and he knew that it was only a matter of time before they struck back. He was right. Later that evening, John received a notice from the HOA, informing him that he was being summoned to an emergency meeting. The meeting was to be held at the clubhouse, and the agenda was simple: to discuss his egregious violation of HOA rules and to determine the appropriate course of action. John knew that this was a trap. Karen and the HOA board members were going to try to humiliate him, to fine him into oblivion, to possibly even evict him from the neighborhood. But he also knew that he couldn't back down. He had to face them, to defend his actions, and to expose their incompetence to the world. He prepared himself for battle, donning his best suit and polishing his shoes. He reviewed the HOA bylaws, brushed up on his legal knowledge, and even practiced his arguments in front of the mirror. As he drove to the clubhouse, he felt a surge of nervous energy. He was about to enter the lion's den, to face the wrath of Karen and her minions. But he was ready. He was armed with the truth, the support of his neighbors, and a healthy dose of righteous indignation. The HOA clubhouse was packed. Every folding chair was occupied, and people were crammed against the walls, eager to witness the spectacle that was about to unfold. The air was thick with anticipation, like the moments before a particularly juicy episode of reality TV. John entered the room to a mixture of cheers and jeers. He spotted Mrs. Henderson, who winked at him, and Mr. Thompson, who gave him a thumbs up. But he also saw Karen, sitting at the head of the table, her face a mask of icy fury. The meeting was called to order by a nervous-looking vice president, who clearly regretted ever volunteering for the position. He introduced Karen, who stepped forward to address the crowd. "Good evening, everyone," she began, her voice dripping with disdain. "We are gathered here tonight to discuss a matter of grave importance. As you all know, our community has been subjected to an act of vandalism, an act of concrete terrorism, perpetrated by none other than Mr. John Smith." She paused for dramatic effect, glaring at John as if he were a particularly unpleasant stain on her designer rug. "Mr. Smith," she continued, "has admitted to flooding the HOA office with concrete, causing extensive damage and disrupting our ability to serve the community." A chorus of murmurs rippled through the crowd. "Therefore," Karen declared, "I propose that we impose the maximum fine allowable under our bylaws, and that we initiate proceedings to evict Mr. Smith from our community." She looked around the room, expecting a unanimous vote of approval. But to her surprise, there was a moment of silence. People were hesitant, unsure of whether to support Karen or to defend John, who had become something of a folk hero in the neighborhood. Finally, Mrs. Henderson stood up. "With all due respect, Karen," she said, "I think we need to consider the context here. Mr. Smith's actions were unconventional, to say the least, but they were also a response to the HOA's negligence. We've all been complaining about the drainage system for years, and you've done nothing about it." A wave of applause erupted from the crowd. Karen's face flushed with anger. "Mrs. Henderson, are you condoning vandalism?" "I'm condoning holding people accountable," Mrs. Henderson retorted. "And frankly, I'm tired of the HOA spending our money on frivolous things like decorative rocks and putting greens while our basic infrastructure crumbles." The tension in the room was palpable. It was clear that Karen was losing control of the situation. Just when it seemed that the meeting was about to descend into total chaos, a small, elderly woman stood up in the back of the room. It was Martha, the quiet, unassuming lady who lived down the street and spent most of her time gardening. "Excuse me," Martha said, her voice trembling slightly. "I have something to say." Everyone turned to look at her, surprised that the usually reserved Martha was about to speak. I'm the one who flooded the HOA office with concrete," she blurted out, her eyes wide with fear. The room erupted in gasps. "What?" Karen exclaimed, her jaw dropping. "Martha, what are you talking about?" Martha took a deep breath and continued. "I've been watching the HOA for years, and I've seen how you've been wasting our money, ignoring our concerns, and generally running this community into the ground. I was angry, and I wanted to do something about it. So, I decided to take matters into my own hands." She pulled out a stack of documents and held them up for everyone to see. "I've been collecting evidence for months, documenting the HOA's mismanagement, their illegal activities, and their blatant disregard for the well-being of the community. I was going to go to the authorities, but then Mr. Smith had his incident, and I realized that I had to come forward." Martha proceeded to lay out her evidence, detailing the HOA's financial irregularities, their violations of environmental regulations, and their general incompetence. The crowd listened in stunned silence as the truth about the HOA was finally revealed. It turned out that Karen and the board members had been embezzling funds, accepting kickbacks from contractors, and generally using the HOA as their personal piggy bank. They had deliberately neglected the drainage system to save money, knowing that it would eventually cause problems. The revelations were devastating. Karen and the board members were exposed as corrupt, self-serving villains, and the community was outraged. A vote was quickly taken, and Karen and the entire board were impeached. A new board was elected, consisting of ordinary homeowners who were committed to serving the community. John was exonerated, and Martha was hailed as a hero. The HOA office was cleaned up, with John's help, of course, and the drainage system was repaired. In the end, justice of a sort had prevailed. The corrupt leaders were ousted, the community was united, and John's backyard finally stopped smelling like sewage. He and Martha became unlikely friends, and she even taught him a thing or two about gardening, although he still preferred coding.